That's a really great question, Zach. How do you respond to objection handling when you're posed with a difficult objection?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that the number one thing is you have to have a process, okay? And you also have to take your time because not every question are you going to know the answer to. So you have to set up a framework that allows you to acknowledge the question, ultimately respond to it, and then have a path that you're moving on from. So you don't get caught in that purgatory of somebody asks you a question, you give a really thoughtful answer, you pause, and instead of them moving on or going into the next step, they just ask another question and you get caught going down that rabbit hole. So the process that I actually use is exactly that. It's called acknowledge, respond, move on, or commonly referred to as ARM. And the real advantage of this is that in its three different components, it covers all of the different silos that you need in answering or managing an objection. So the first part, say somebody hits you in the objection, I don't know if that price is right for me. Acknowledge. That's great. That's a great point, Mr. Customer. And honestly, when I first started working in this organization and I saw the price, I was a little concerned about our ability to deliver value behind it as well. What you've done there is you've gotten on the side of the customer. You've acknowledged their question. They understand that you've acknowledged their question, that you understand it. And you've also put yourself on the side of the customer. Rather than in this sort of opposing sense, you're sitting on the same side of the table as them. Hey, I used to think the exact same way. Now you go into your response. Though I used to think the exact same way, Mr. Customer, through a bunch of our case studies, customer testimonials, organizations I've worked with, we actually have recognized a significant return on investment for organizations in X and X fashion, right? So now what you've done is you've acknowledged the question, you've given your response, myriad of response options that you have, but then the most important part comes, which is the move on component. So at that point, you say, listen, Mr. Customer, with all of that said, my goal today was to set you up for a call next week to really get you engaged with one of our customers and see if we can provide that value for you. So does tomorrow at 2 o'clock work, or should we look at Thursday next week? And the reason why that's really important is because then now that becomes the topic of conversation, not the question. The topic of conversation is how we're going to move on, which as a BDR or even as a sales rep, that's exactly the position you want. Focusing on what are our next steps going to be and where do we go from here?
That's a fantastic framework. Do you only use that once?
No. Honestly, amazing question back. No, actually, I use it over and over and over again. So when I get my first objection, I'll acknowledge, I'll respond, and I'll move on to it. And then if the customer is sort of savvy enough that they go back to my response and dig a little bit deeper, I will deploy the same methodology again. Right? Thanks for pointing that out. And I'm happy that you actually caught that. Again, this is something, again, I'm giving myself that second. What am I going to say? What am I going to think during my acknowledge? Then I can hit them again with my response. And then at the end, I go back to trying them to move on. Right? And I will wait for them to pull me back into the question answer situation. I just want to get them onto the next call. Right? So that's something that for me, if you're following a framework like acknowledge, respond, move on, I've seen a few different ones out there. The most important thing for you is not to get caught in that purgatory of question and answer on the cold call, or even in an objection handling scenario when you're in a sale. You want to acknowledge the question, respond to the question, and then move on the conversation to the next parts so you can continue what is actually your agenda for the meeting.
That's a fantastic framework, and I'm glad that you brought up other frameworks as well. How does this differ from feel, felt, found?
So for me, like when you're looking at feel, felt, found, that's a way of communicating, right? I'm trying to feel out how you're thinking, then I'm going to try and find an area that we're going to be able to go down, and I'm going to present that, right? That's feel, felt, found. That's something I'm going to be doing on all of my calls, right? Is understanding the position, sort of becoming that empathetic salesperson. Acknowledge, respond, move on is just a framework that whenever you hear an objection, again, an objection, not a rejection, right? And we can cover that in a different episode because there's a significant difference. But when you capture an objection, it's just a framework that allows you to think on your feet, give yourself a little bit of time, make sure that you're focused on the question, and then ultimately that you're still showing your agenda to focus and move forward. So you would be using feel, felt, found alongside using ARM.
Fantastic. Great way. I anticipate that it's going to be very helpful for our viewers at home.
I hope so. No problem.